Welcome to Theories of the Third Kind. My name is Aaron. The other host joining us today is Danielson.
Hello.
Now, before we start today's episode, we have a couple of announcements to make.
If you would like to support the show, you can do so by joining our premium subscription service, Supercast. For just $6.66 a month, you can enjoy weekly premium audio episodes and access to our entire back catalog of over 300 plus episodes that are all ad free.
Or if you're a big baller and you want to see our faces, then you can sign up to our premium video service for $9.99. And you can get access to that by going to theoriesofthethirdkind.com and clicking on the Supercast button that's right there in the middle of the website.
Now, we know things are tough out there right now. So if you can't afford a premium membership, but you still want to help us out, you can do so by leaving us a written review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
That helps us out a lot.
It does. However, if you don't feel like it, that's okay. Because we just want you guys, girls, aliens, reptilians, Bigfoot, Sasquatches, chupacabras, ghosts, Illuminati members, underground lizard people, whoever, whatever you are, to enjoy the show. Also, remember, our content is entirely human made. No AI was used or harmed in the process other than for the base graphic template.
And that is the end of the announcements. All right. So, our entire episode today starts off in a quiet English village in Woolpit in the 12th century. It was there that two little children appeared out of nowhere. They spoke no known language, refused to eat normal prepared food, and most disturbingly of all, their skin was the color green. It was not pale, it wasn't dirty, but green in a way that made people go like, "Oh, holy shit. These kids, these kids either belong to the Hulk or Shrek. Get off me farm.
Get out my swamp.
Get off me swamp." And everyone kind of stared at him. Was like, "What the hell's wrong with these kids?"
When these children were finally able to explain where they came from, their answer did not calm, nor did it explain or make the situation any clearer. In fact, it just made everything about them and the situation even more unsettling.
They were not from any nearby villages, and they weren't from a nearby kingdom that anyone knew. They were from a place where the sun never fully rose, where everything existed in a constant dim light, almost like a strange twilight world that they called Forks, Washington. Okay, maybe it wasn't Forks, Washington. It was a place called St. Martin's Land.
Sounds like forks.
It does.
So that is what we're going over today. We are stepping into the world of Woolpit to see whether or not this was just a big misunderstanding of the kids, or perhaps these kids were from somewhere else entirely.
And speaking of somewhere else entirely, Woolpit is not like your average town or anything even remotely close to a modern city back then. It is a very small rural village located in eastern England in the county of Suffolk, which sits in a region known for flat farmland, open skies, and long stretches of agricultural land that goes on for miles.
Woolpit itself is about 8 to 10 miles east of the larger town of Bury St. Edmunds, which would have been one of the nearest significant hubs of trade, religion, and authority during the 12th century.
Geographically, the area is part of what is called the East Anglia, a region that is mostly low lying with gentle rolling terrain rather than steep hills or mountains. This meant that the land was wide open, exposed, and heavily used for farming, especially crops like barley, wheat, and beans.
In the medieval period, Woolpit itself would not have been more than a few dozen households, maybe somewhere between 100 to 300 people at most. But they weren't all tucked in together like it is in the cities. They were spread out in a loose cluster all over Woolpit.
Now, the average physical footprint of the village would have been small, probably covering less than a square mile for the main settlement, but the land the villagers depended on stretched out much further. The fields extended outward in every direction, broken up by dirt paths and small wooded areas.
Surrounding the village, you would have patches of forest and brush. Not massive deep wilderness like you would imagine, but enough tree cover to create shadows, hide animals, and make certain areas feel isolated, especially at dusk or dawn.
Now, one of the most important features tied to Woolpit, and the thing that gives it its name, are the wolf pits themselves. These are essentially deep holes dug into the ground, often lined or concealed, designed to trap wolves that wandered too close to livestock or people.
So if you thought it had anything to do with like wool, it's not the case. It was wolves. These pits would have been located just outside the main village area, in the fields, or along the edges of wooded zones.
Which is exactly why the discovery of the children near these pits is such a key detail, because it places them right at the boundary between the known, safe area inside the village and the unknown, potentially dangerous areas with the predators. Not Chris Hansen predators, wolf predators, animal predators, not sexual predators. Hey, there might have been.
There might have
We
been,
don't know.
and back then, they did have a wolf problem. I remember we talked about it before in one of our episodes over a cryptid.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of size compared to something like modern, if you sit back and try to picture it, Woolpit would be less like a town and more like a small neighborhood that was surrounded by miles of open land, which I can't think of really a city that people would like really think of because that's no longer the case around these parts.
Yeah.
Imagine it though. You could stand in the field and see across the landscape for a long ass way and with very little blocking your view except low vegetation and the occasional cluster of trees.
And there were no modern lights, no noises from machines, and very little movement beyond people and animals. The entire area would feel quiet, almost unnaturally still at times.
And all of this is what makes the setting so important to this story because it's not a crowded or chaotic place where something strange could easily go unnoticed. This is a small, controlled environment where anything out of the ordinary would stand out immediately.
Also, we can't forget how life would be back then, living in the 12th century under the reign of King Stephen. Life was simple on the surface, but incredibly hard and uncertain underneath. Most people lived as peasants whose entire existence revolved around farming, survival, and staying in good standing with both their lord and their church.
So a typical day would begin at sunrise and end at sunset, with no real concept of weekends or time off. Just a constant cycle of planting, harvesting, and tending needy animals, repairing tools, and then doing whatever needed to be done to keep food in their bellies.
The homes were small and basic. They were usually made of mud, wood, and thatch. Well, wood, mud, and thatch, and often shared with animals during the colder months. You had little privacy and very little possessions beyond what was absolutely necessary to survive. You're sitting there taking a shit, everybody would watch you. Sitting there taking a piss, everybody would watch you. Sitting there jerking it, everybody would watch you. Even the animals.
The animals, especially cows, pigs, horses, probably.
Yeah.
Now, the food was plain and repetitive, mostly consisting of bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasionally meat if it was available. So, mostly the people relied heavily on crops like grains and beans to get through the year, especially during harsh winters or poor harvests. I figured they'd have a lot more meat with all the wolves, but I guess the wolves were winning.
On top of this, this was a time of instability in England known as the Anarchy, which was a period of civil conflict over the English throne, which meant even a small village like Woolpit felt physically removed from large scale battles. The effects could still be felt through food shortages and the weight of shifting powers.
Which we go into more of the anarchy and the strange facts and findings.
Nice. Anarchy.
Anarchy!
The British are coming. Wrong. Wrong.
wrong,
Wrong.
wrong.
Wrong area and period.
So there you have it. That is Woolpit, and pretty much during that time period under the reign of King Stephen during the anarchy.
So it gives you a good feel of what the area was like.
Yeah. Wasn't all pleasant. A lot of shit happening. But now we get to hop into the meat of the episode, the children, or the Green Children of Woolpit.
All right. So this story about the Green Children of Woolpit is told by two main sources at the time. The first source is William of Newburgh, who was who was an English historian writing in the late 1100s, so pretty close to the time of the event. William included the story in his work of Historia Rerum Anglicarium, which was meant to document historical events, not just myths and legends.
Now, the second being Ralph of Coggeshall, who was an abbot and chronicler, also writing in the late 12th century to early 13th century. He recorded the story in his own chronicle, and his version overlaps with Williams, but also has a few small differences and details.
But there is a catch. Even though these two are respected during their time, neither of them personally witnessed this event or talked to the children themselves. That means this story is a secondhand or possibly third hand account. But with that being said, we're still going to get into the story and talk about it. So this is how it goes.
So during the time period of 1135 to 1154, it was during the harvest season in Woolpit. Farmers out in the fields doing the same damn thing they did every day, tending the crops, watching livestock, cows and pigs shitting everywhere, and moving through their routines that had probably not changed much for generations.
Then, at some point, some random people noticed movement near the wolf pits, which at first would not have seemed unusual, since animals often wandered near those traps and then they fell into them. So, a couple people went over near the traps and they quickly discovered that it was not an animal inside there.
Standing near the pits were two children, a boy and a girl, both human in shape, but the townsfolk immediately knew they were different in a way that was pretty much impossible to ignore. So, of course, Woolpit was a small village at that time, so strangers definitely stood out right away. Especially two random children by themselves were strange enough.
It was their appearance, though, that was unsettling to the people in the town. The children's skin had a green tint, not faint or imaginative. It was noticeable enough that it became the first thing people would mention when describing these kids.
Racist.
Their clothing only added to the confusion because it did not match any known style from the surrounding regions.
The fabric, the way it was put together, even the general look of it did not fit into anything of that time period, which immediately suggested that these children were not from another nearby village, but from somewhere much further away and stranger.
When the villagers tried to speak to the children, just asking the basic questions about who they were, where they're from, the children responded, just not in a language that anyone could understand. It was not English, not Latin, and not anything recognizable.
The sound of their speech was human enough to know it was a language, but it carried no meaning to those listening, which only deepened the sense that something was not right about the situation at all.
So at this point, you can only imagine the fear that naturally started to build up looking and trying to communicate with these kids, especially at the time when people believed strongly in signs and in omens. Something like this did not feel random. It felt like it meant something and not necessarily something good.
But despite those fears, the villagers did not harm the children or drive them away. Instead, they chose to bring them into their village. They did not let fear overcome their sense of responsibility to help these children.
So the villagers got together and they tried to give food to the children. Normal food like bread, meat, and veggies, expecting that hunger would eventually make them eat. But the children refused everything that was given to them.
Should give me some jerky. I'd be happy for days.
Anyway, so this went on for quite some time, long enough to become a big concern, because without food, it was clear that they would not survive. So the villagers were left trying to understand what kind of food that these children would accept or eat.
And after many different foods were presented to the kids, someone decided to just give them raw beans. Like, shit, you won't eat what we cook, eat these raw beans. And to the villagers' surprise, the kids' reaction was immediate. They recognized the food instantly and began eating the beans like a pack of starving wolves. It was like the only food that they encountered that made sense to them to eat. Everything else was just confusing for them.
And it was at that moment alone that raised even more questions, because it suggested that wherever they came from, their diet was completely different from what the villagers expected. This just reinforced the idea that these children were not just lost, but truly out of place. They had time traveled or dimension traveled.
That's what it starts to sound like.
Yeah. Get these weird ass fucking kids out of here. Put them in the autistic room.
Get these green tainted kids away from me. Now, the children were eventually taken in by a local landowner, Sir Richard Decane, who provided them with shelter and protection. This gave the children a chance to recover and possibly adapt to their new environment. However, their outcomes were not the same.
The boy began to weaken over time, struggling to adjust, refusing most foods. He gradually started to lose strength in a way that the villagers could not explain. However, there was no clear illness No visible injuries to him, nothing that the villagers could point at and say, hey, that's the cause, or that's the reason that the boy is losing all of his strength and growing frail. Eventually, despite the attempts that were made to help the poor boy, he ended up passing away.
Now, the girl, on the other hand, survived and slowly began to adapt to life in the village. She started to eat more normal foods and became more comfortable in her surroundings.
One of the most striking changes was obviously her appearance. The green skin, or the green tint of her skin, began to fade over time. It gradually disappeared until she looked like any other person in the village, which raised the possibility that whatever caused it, as in whatever caused her skin to be green, was temporary or tied to her previous environment.
And as she continued to live in the village, she learned English and was actually able to communicate with the villagers. Then, naturally, after all this time of not being able to communicate, the villagers bombarded her with questions.
Oi, where did you come from? How did you end up in Woolpit? And why was your skin green?
Her explanations were unlike anything they could have expected. She described a place called St. Martin's Land, where everything was green and the light was dim, with no full sunlight, only a constant twilight that never fully turned into day.
Boy, that must have been miserable.
Miserable. It's like living in like Alaska or up north where it's like 12-hour days, or they call it what, the midnight moon or something like that, or midnight sun, because it doesn't really set.
Ugh. The girl explained that she and her brother had been herding cattle when they heard a loud noise, something unusual enough to catch their attention. And when they went to investigate the noise, they suddenly found themselves somewhere completely different from where they were at.
She did not describe a journey or a long expedition, but rather an abrupt transition, as if they had simply crossed from one place into another without understanding how or why it happened. She never addressed why her skin was green, since that was normal from where they came from, it seems.
Then, over time, she would continue to live and grow up in this village of Woolpit, with some accounts suggesting that she was baptized and later married, possibly marrying a man from the neighboring town of King's Lynn. Not King's Landing, but King's Lynn.
So eventually she became part of the community, but the most important detail of these recounts or accounts is that she never changed her story about where she came from, St. Martin's Land. And so after she became normal to the eyes of the villagers, the mystery about the children simply just kind of vanished, as it wasn't worth being recorded to the people at the time.
And there you have it. That right there is the entire story of the Green Children of Woolpit. However, just like every week, we're now going to get into the strange facts and findings that we discovered while sleuthing through the interwebs. So, with that being said, Dan, would you like to start it off for us?
All right, so our first strange fact and finding is about the two sources that the stories come from. We mentioned them at the beginning of the story: William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall.
William of Newburgh, like we said, was a historian back in the 1100s and wrote this story in his work called the Historia Rerum Anglicarum. Now, what's important about him is that he had a reputation for being skeptical and critical.
So this meant that he didn't just blindly write down every strange story he heard, which makes it interesting that he chose to include the story in his works. So his version of the story is one of the most detailed, describing the children's appearance, their strange language, their diet of beans, and the girl's explanation of St. Martin's Land.
In Book 1, Chapter 27, called Of the Green Children, he is quoted saying, though it is asserted by many, yet I have long been in doubt concerning the matter, and deemed it ridiculous to give credit to a circumstance supported on no rational foundation, or at least one of a mysterious character. Yet at length I was so overwhelmed by the weight of so many and such competent witnesses that I have been compelled to believe and wonder over a matter which I was unable to comprehend or unravel by any powers of intellect. End quote. Basically, is what he's saying. Man, this story sounded real as fuck, and I had to write about it.
Especially with the amount of witnesses that came to him and made it impossible to ignore. There is another part of the story that he wrote that kind of confused us. Figured it was worth mentioning.
It goes on to say, in old ass English, by the way, and we quote, While wandering through the fields in astonishment, they were seized by the reapers, the guys cutting down the beans and such with size. Anyway, the kids were conducted to the village, and many persons coming to see so novel a sight, they were kept some days without food.
They were starving those little fuckers.
They were starving them, they were keeping them captive.
But when they were nearly exhausted with hunger, and yet could relish no species of support which was offered to them, it happened that some beans were brought in from the field, which they immediately seized with avidity, and examined the stalk for the pulse, but not finding it in the hollow of the stalk, they wept bitterly.
Upon this, one of the bystanders, taking the beans from the pods, offered them to the children, who seized them directly and ate them with pleasure. By this food, they were supported for many months, until they learnt the use of bread.
From what this sounds like, they starved the kids to pretty much on the verge of death. And then they gave them food just to keep them alive till they got answers.
Yeah, and then the boy still died.
And the boy still died.
Yeah. Anyway, so that is what William wrote down. Now let's talk about the second guy, Ralph of Coggleshaw. His works about the children were written down in the Chronicle and Clarianum in all Latin. It was originally translated by Thomas Knightley in the 1800s.
In his version, the children were taken from the fields where they were wandering and immediately brought into the care of Sir Richard, aka Sir Dick, the Cane. He decided to look after them and try to understand where they had come from.
It was believed that they just refused to eat any food that was brought to them, which made Sir Dick think that they could not survive long. But when they saw the beans, they immediately showed interest and opened the pods, eating the beans.
Even though the boy eventually died unable to adapt and survive off of just beans, the girl was able to adapt and started to eat more food. Other than that, the stories are alike, but where they came from and what happened to them to end up in Woolpit from St. Martin's Land stayed the same. Pretty much loud noise, investigated, and boom, we're in Woolpit.
Hmm, odd.
Very odd.
So, were they starved or were they not starved?
That's where the story is differs. Like one of them says that they were pretty much brought in and sounds like they were kept captive and starved until they were like giving the answers. Then they gave them food just enough to survive, and only thing they would eat was beans. And then the other account is that they were taken into care of the nearby like Sir Richard DeCane, and he was giving them food and such, but they would only eat beans. So there's two sides of it. One, they were starved in question. The other one was they taken care of in question.
I say starved.
I think starved because,
Yeah.
I mean, the boy died, so obviously he was probably if the brother was cool and a hero, he was giving his food to his sister. That's why she survived. I'm just saying that.
All right, so let's talk about our next strange fact and finding, which is about villages during the anarchy. And like we mentioned earlier, the anarchy was a period of instability and conflict over the English throne at the time.
Now, there were regions of England that where entire villages didn't just struggle. They were completely abandoned, leaving behind empty homes, unused fields, and land that had once been actively farmed suddenly go quiet, silent. This wasn't always because of one single event, but rather a combination of raids, food shortages, fear, and instability that made it impossible for people to safely remain where they were.
When armies moved through an area, they often took whatever they needed: food, animal, supplies, sometimes leaving families with nothing to survive on. If that happened more than once, people in that area would often be forced to leave, either relocating to safer areas or scattering in different directions.
Over time, this created pockets of land where structures still stood, but the people who once lived there were gone, turning once lively communities into quiet, empty spaces.
What makes this especially unsettling is what it implies for the people who didn't leave together, because in situations like this, families could easily become separated, whether during travel, in moments of panic, or simply because not everyone was able to keep up.
Especially children, in particular, were at risk of being left behind, lost along the way, or separated without any clear path back to where they came from. So, a lot of parents would panic, pack their stuff up, and one thing they would forget would be their kids.
How the fuck you forget your kids? It's like those people who like leave their kids in the back of the car during like whatever and they just forget them. It's like, how do you forget your kids in the car?
There's been so many of those where parents leave their kids overnight in the vehicle. It's like, you do have an infant, right? Yeah. Where is it? Oh my God.
All right, so let's get on to our next strange fact and finding, which is about the Flemish, the people of Flanders. Now, why do we bring these people up? Well, it fits into a theory about who and where these children came from, considering their appearance and possible language.
So the Flemish were a group of people from a region of medieval Europe known as Flanders, which is roughly located in what is now northern Belgium, with parts of the Netherlands and northern France. During the Middle Ages, they were known for being skilled workers, traders, and farmers, especially in industries like cloth making and textiles.
Flanders itself was one of the most economically active regions in Europe at the time, with busy towns and strong trade networks, particularly connected to wool and cloth production. This made the Flemish people valuable to other parts of Europe, including England, where wool was a major resource.
Because of this, many Flemish individuals and families migrated to England, either voluntarily for work and opportunity or because they were displaced by conflict and economic pressures back home. In England, the Flemish often settled in rural areas or towns where their skills could be used, especially in farming and weaving.
But despite their usefulness, they were still considered outsiders. They spoke different dialects, had different customs, and didn't always integrate smoothly with the local population, which sometimes led to tension or mistrust.
So during the time in the reign of King Stephen, things became even more unstable, and Flemish groups were sometimes caught in the middle of political and military conflicts. This could have resulted in them being pushed out of settlements, scattered, or forced to move quickly from one place to another.
This instability meant that families could be separated, and children, especially in chaotic situations, could end up lost, displaced, or taken in by other communities. So just keep that in mind when we get to theories. Okay.
Yeah, because the Flemish, they were good at weaving and stuff, so obviously the kids were found with clothes that they didn't recognize,
Mm-hmm.
so it kind of
And
fits with them.
spoke a language and dialect that they could not recognize.
Exactly.
Ooh.
All right, so our next strange fact and finding is about English folklore involving more individuals pretty much being green. So when you start looking into English folklore and some broader European folklore, the ideas of beings with green skin is not as random as it sounds at first.
In fact, it shows up more often than you would expect, especially in stories connected to nature, hidden worlds, and things that exist just outside of normal human life. One of the most well known examples is the Green Man, a figure found carved into churches and buildings across England.
Now, the green man is often depicted as a face surrounded by or made entirely of leaves, symbolizing nature, rebirth, and something ancient that exists alongside humanity, but not quite part of it. While the green man is not a child or person in the traditional sense, the color green in this context is consistently tied to something otherworldly, something connected to the natural world in a deeper, almost supernatural way.
Beyond that, many medieval stories describe fairies, or what people at the time called the Fae, as beings who lived in hidden realms, sometimes underground or in places just out of sight. These beings, the Fae, were often described as having unusual features, including strange skin tones, with green being one of the reoccurring descriptions in certain regional tales.
These beings, the Fae, were not always small, winged creatures like modern depictions, but human like figures who could interact with people. They would sometimes appear lost, confused, or even blending into human society temporarily before disappearing again.
In some of these stories, humans who entered fairy realms describe the environment in ways that sound oddly similar to the Green Children's account, mentioning dim light and strange colors. There are also tales of what were sometimes called wild people or forest dwellers, individuals who were believed to live on the edges of human settlements.
They were often associated with the color green either through their appearance or their constant connection to the natural environment. These figures were not always seen as threatening, but they were understood as being different, not fully part of human society, and sometimes not fully understood at all.
So these kids were just fairies,
They could have been the Fae or wild people, forest dwellers, so possible.
the wildlings.
The wildlings.
Anyway, so let's get on to our next strange fact and
They were
finding.
beyond the wall.
It's beyond the wall. All right, so our next strange fact and finding is about chlorosis. So, in our sleuthing to figure out why the skin or why human skin could turn green, we stumbled upon what is known as chlorosis, which was historically called green sickness.
Green sickness or chlorosis is essentially an old term for what we now understand as a form of iron deficiency anemia, meaning the body does not have enough iron to produce healthy red blood cells, which are responsible for carrying oxygen throughout the body.
Now, when someone does not have enough iron, their blood cannot transport oxygen efficiently, and that lack of oxygen starts to affect how the entire body functions, leading to symptoms like fatigue, weakness, dizziness, and shortness of breath, alongside a noticeable change in appearance.
The reason chlorosis became associated with the color green is not because people literally turned green like something out of a fantasy story. It was because their skin would become extremely pale and sometimes take on a slightly yellow, gray, or faintly greenish tint, especially under poor lighting conditions or when combined with dirt, malnutrition, and the general lack of hygiene common in medieval times.
Back then, people did not have the medical vocabulary we have today. So instead of describing subtle shifts in skin tone, they would often use broader, more visual terms, and green became a way to describe someone who looked sickly, unnatural, or not quite right.
Now, chlorosis was most commonly seen in people with poor diets, particularly those who did not consume enough iron rich foods like meat, which was not always available to lower classes, as well as in young individuals whose bodies required more nutrients than they were getting. The symptoms could be quite severe in some cases, including extreme tiredness, headaches, cold sensitivity, brittle nails, and even fainting, all of which would make a person appear weak and visibly unwell.
Or maybe they just got a bad ticker.
Or bad thyroid.
Yeah. In a medieval village setting where nutrition was limited and medical knowledge was minimal, conditions like this could easily go undiagnosed and be interpreted as something mysterious or even supernatural. Maybe these kids had chlorosis.
The green sickness,
Yeah.
possible. Now, our last strange fact and finding is about different realms, not like kingdoms, but worlds. So we try to see if there were any more tales of different worlds during the same time period.
One example that we did find was the story of King Hurla, a figure in English folklore who was said to have visited a supernatural realm after encountering a mysterious king. When he returned, he found that time had passed differently, which points to the idea that people believed in places that operated under completely different rules than the normal world, like the land of the Fae. Other than that, there was nothing else that described or related to St. Martin's Land. That was the only thing that we found.
Yeah, so there was one account of a different world.
Hmm.
I figured there'd be more, but.
Yeah.
And that right there was our last strange fact and finding. Now we get to go into the fun part theories.
Theories as to where or what these children could have actually been. Was it fake? Was it real? Was it all made up? Were they aliens? Let's figure it out.
All right, so our first theory that we have is called the children of the fairy realm, the Fae. This theory leans into medieval folklore and suggests that the children were not from another country, but from a hidden realm, often referred to as the land of the Fae, a place believed to exist alongside the human world, but normally out of reach. This works surprisingly well when you compare it to the girl's description, because fairy realms in European folklore are often described as places with strange lighting, unusual colors, and the environments that feel similar to ours but not quite the same, which lines up with the idea of a green tinted world in a constant twilight. The language barrier also fits, as beings from these realms were often described as speaking in ways humans could not understand, and their sudden appearance near the wolf pits could be interpreted as crossing some kind of boundary between worlds. Even the detail of the children gradually adapting to the human life fits into certain folklore stories, where beings from other realms would lose their original traits over time as they remained in the human world. But this theory has its weaknesses, mainly that it relies heavily on the belief systems and folklore rather than physical evidence. And while it explains the story in a way that feels internally consistent, it doesn't provide a verifiable or testable explanation. It also raises the question of why this event is so rare if such crossings were possible, and why are there no consistent follow up accounts of similar beings appearing in the same way?
Yeah. If there was like a village of green children, why didn't other villages talk about green children showing up or green people or encountering green people or children?
I mean, technically, there could have been. but there just weren't enough accounts of people like bombarding, say, William of Newburgh, I think it was, or Ralph of Coggleshaw. It's like, hey man, there's a bunch of green fuckers running around over here. No one really like. If there were other towns that did have that, they probably weren't spreading it. They were probably like, shit. If we went and said this, they probably think that we have witches in the town.
They
Next thing you
come burn
know,
us all.
yeah,
Yeah. Or it could be this next theory, which is called chlorosis and medieval misinterpretation. So this theory focuses on less of where the children came from and more on how they were perceived, suggesting that the green skin was not literal, but instead a result of a medical condition like chlorosis, combined with the way people in the 12th century described illness and appearance. This theory works because chlorosis, a form of anemia, can cause the skin to appear pale with a faint greenish or yellowish tint, especially under poor lighting conditions, which would have been common in a medieval village with no artificial lighting. You add in dirt, malnutrition, and the lack of medical understanding at the time, and it becomes easy to see how villagers might describe someone as green, even if the color was subtle or inconsistent. It also explains why the girl's skin color faded over time, because as she began to eat a more balanced diet and started to adapt to a village life, her health would have improved, causing her complexion to return to normal. However, this theory falls apart when you move beyond appearance because chlorosis does not explain the language barrier. It does not explain the detailed story of St. Martin's Land, and it does not explain the children's behavior, especially their strict refusal to eat anything but beans at first. So while it may explain how they looked, it doesn't explain who they were or where they came from, which means it only solves a part of the mystery.
yeah. I mean, honestly, that's top right there.
Yeah.
The next theory that we have is called the lost Flemish children. This theory suggests that the green children were actually Flemish immigrants, part of a group of people from what is now Belgium who had settled in parts of England during the 12th century. And during the chaos of the time, especially around the conflict under King Stephen and the anarchy, it's possible that these children became separated from their community and ended up wandering into Woolpit. This theory works because it explains several key details in a grounded way. Their unfamiliar language could have been Flemish, which would have sounded completely foreign to English villagers. Their strange clothing could have reflected a different culture, and their diet, especially their immediate recognition of beans, lines up with what people in that region commonly ate. It also ties into the idea of chlorosis or malnutrition, where a poor diet and lack of nutrients could give the skin a pale, slightly greenish tint, which might have been exaggerated or misunderstood by the villagers. But where this theory starts to struggle is in the details that feel too specific or too strange to ignore, especially the description of St. Martin's Land as a place with no full sunlight and constant twilight, which does not match any known region in Flanders or England. It also doesn't fully explain why the children refused all food except beans at first, since starving children would typically eat whatever is available, nor does it explain how they ended up alone in such a specific location without clear signs of a nearby settlement or group searching for them. So while this theory is practical and grounded, it leaves behind just enough unanswered questions to keep it from fully closing the case.
I'm going to save my thoughts and theories until the end.
Aliens.
Yes. So our next theory is called parallel world or dimensional slip. This theory suggests that the children came from a real place, but not one that exists within our normal understanding of geography, instead, coming from a parallel world that exists alongside ours, separated by a boundary that can occasionally be crossed under the right conditions. This theory works because it directly aligns with the girl's descriptions of St. Martin's Land, especially the idea of a world with different lighting, different environmental conditions, and a sudden, unexplained transition into our world without a clear journey. The detail about hearing a sound, a loud sound, and following it before suddenly appearing in Woolpit fits surprisingly well with modern interpretations of accidentally crossing or slipping between realities where movement between worlds is not intentional, but triggered by specific circumstances. It also explains why everything about them seemed almost human, but not quite, including their appearance, language, and behavior, as if they came from a version of reality that developed differently. Where this theory struggles, though, is that it is extremely difficult to prove or test, as it relies on concepts that are still largely theoretical, even today, and there is no physical evidence beyond the story itself to support the existence of such a crossing over. It also depends heavily on taking the girl's account at face value, which leaves room for doubt about whether her explanation was literal, misunderstood, or shaped by her experience after arriving. Damn, I like that one.
I mean, if you look up St. Martin's Land, there's only one account, and that's with this story. Nothing else describes it or uses that name at all. Which what's the name of Epstein's Island?
Little St. James?
Thought it was Martin. Little St. Martin. All right. The next theory that we have is called extraterrestrial visitors. This theory takes a more unconventional approach and suggests that the children were not from Earth at all, but from another planet, and that their appearance in Woolpit was the result of some kind of unknown transportation or accidental arrival. This works on a surface level because several details line up with what people today associate with extraterrestrial encounters, including unusual skin color, an unknown language, unfamiliar clothing, and a description of their home that does not match any known place on Earth. The idea of following a sound and suddenly appearing somewhere else could be interpreted as a form of transport or displacement that the children themselves did not understand. It also explains why their diet and behavior seem so different, as they may not have been adapted to human food or environment. However, this theory faces significant challenges, mainly that it applies that modern ideas to a medieval story, which can sometimes create connections that were never originally intended, and there is no supporting evidence beyond the narrative itself to suggest extraterrestrial involvement. It also doesn't fully explain why their world would be described in such a simple Earth like terms rather than something more clearly alien, which makes the theory feel both intriguing and slightly disconnected from the historical context. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the place they describe does sound more Earth like than
Alien.
alien.
Yeah. Maybe they're just like half alien, half humans.
Maybe they lived underground.
Yeah. Maybe that's why it's so dim. St. Martin's Land. Maybe.
Maybe.
Well, we'll get into our own personal thoughts and theories after this last theory, which is called the forest camouflage children. This theory suggests that the children may have been living in or moving through wooded areas for an extended period of time, and that their green appearance wasn't natural at all, but instead came from plant material like moss, crushed leaves, or sap being rubbed onto their skin, either intentionally for camouflage or simply as a result of surviving in that environment. Now, this theory works on the surface because if you've ever had a grass stain or plant stain on your clothing or skin, you know that it can be surprisingly stubborn to get off, especially when mixed with sweat, dirt, and natural oils. And in a medieval setting where bathing was infrequent and soap was limited, it's possible that staining could build up over time and create a noticeable tint. If the children had been hiding in wooded areas, possibly trying to avoid danger or surviving on their own for a period of time, they could have been constantly exposed to the plant matter, sleeping on the ground, moving through the brush, and interacting with vegetation in a way that could leave residue on their skin, making them appear discolored when first discovered. It also gives a potential explanation for their behavior, because children living outside of normal society for even a short time could become disoriented, fearful, and less responsive to unfamiliar people, which might explain why they didn't communicate clearly or accept food right away. But this theory starts to break down when you look at the details more closely, because plant stains typically affect the surface of the skin unevenly, creating blotchy or patchy discoloration rather than a consistent full body tint that multiple witnesses described as noticeable and uniform. It also doesn't fully explain why the color would be described so distinctly as green rather than just dirty or stained, especially in a time when people were already familiar with what dirt and outdoor exposure look like on the human body. And most importantly, it doesn't explain the language barrier or the detailed account of St. Martin's Land, which are some of the most unusual parts of the story and can't be accounted for by environmental exposure alone. That right there is the last theory. I'm going to hand the microphone over to you, Dan, and ask you, out of all these theories and your own personal thoughts and theories, what do you believe is the truth behind these green children of Woolpit?
I'm gonna go with chlorosis and in this last theory that they lived out in the forest and that it was like a mixture of plant matter and dirt and sweat and all that on their skin. where they come from, I think they were children that were probably separated. They were probably Flemish or just English. They were just separated from family. But then again, they were. This is where it gets me because they were living in somewhere with people and they were herding cattle at the time. So maybe they weren't separated. Maybe their family was separated, or like a little bit of the community did get separated, and they found somewhere that was probably deep in the can't really say wilderness because there wasn't a lot of big wooded areas, but maybe I'd say an underground wooded area because that's where I'm starting to think where the dim light's coming from. And they're surviving off of mostly like plant stuff. They probably did have like milk and all that if they had cattle, and they probably didn't really have meat because I mean they were probably limited on cattle. So they survived on like milk and water with plants. And they probably lived in like huts and stuff made of a bunch of plants. They probably slept on grass. So I'm thinking it's just a part of chlorosis where they had iron deficiency and they were pretty much sleeping on plants or rubbing stuff on their skin to help keep them kind of hidden. So if they did get spotted, it'd be hard to keep track of them in the woods because they probably didn't want to be involved in the other community. So that's where I'm going with it. I don't think they're interdimensional beings or aliens. That loud boom they heard, I mean, it was during the time of, the anarchy, so if there was conflict, they probably heard a cannon or something. I don't know if did they have cannons back then? During
I'm
Joseph?
pretty sure they didn't have cannons. No,
No cannons?
none.
Oh, that throws it for a loop. I don't know what the loud boom would have been that they followed then. Maybe a rock or something from their little underground area fell. They probably were followed that. So underground people suffering from chlorosis and just were dirty as fuck. That's all I can really think. I don't really think that they're like the Fae. They're not interdimensional beings, no aliens. Just malnourished kids that were living underground with their little community and they didn't know how to make their way back. I mean, shit, they probably did know how to make their way back, but it was at that point if you get caught, you're screwed. Like you don't want to lead them to your secret little community that your family lived at.
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck on picking what it could be. I'm gonna go with like one of two things. One, it really happened. These children were a part of some other community that spoke a different language. The boom that they heard was some volcanic eruption because there were a lot of volcanoes erupting at the time. Heard a volcano erupt in the distance. They decided to go walk and try to figure out what it was. They get lost. They wander through the forest for some time, come across this one of those pits. They get discovered by the Reapers. The Reapers bring them back to the village. They initially don't feed the children because they think, maybe they're part of some like rebellion or something. So they keep him captive. They start feeding him. The boy dies. Over time, the girl starts learning the language, but many years later, when she describes things and her skin goes back to normal because of chlorosis, but as she's describing things, St. Martin's Land is not what she said. It's misinterpreted. They interpret it as St. Martin's Land, but she actually said something else. And the reason why I say this is because way back in the day when you had immigrants come over, like from Ireland and all those places, or England or whatever, come over to America and they would document them. There was like, for an example, family of Kerr, Kerr, was wrote down as Carr, Carr. You had a lot of families whose last name was like wrote down wrong because of their accent and all that. So I think if that was the case that happened, it was misinterpreted St. Martin's Land. And then this guy saw this story and then wrote about it. Number two, this other theory I'm kind of 50-50 with, it was all made up. The guy made it up. That's it. That's what I'm going with.
The both guys?
The first guy, William or whatever. Was it William?
There's William and then there's Ralph. Both of them, they talked to different people to come up with a story.
Yeah. But I think it was made up.
I mean, it is only secondhand and third hand accounts. They never went and interviewed the children. They never saw the children for themselves.
That's what I'm thinking it is.
Hmm.
One of those two.
I mean, it could be honestly all made up because even William was very skeptical of it. But the only reason he added it to his story is because so many people were coming to him with it, saying there was these green children, that come from somewhere called St. Martin's Land. So that's pretty much what he wrote. And honestly, it just sounded like it was an easier way to write, hey, we captured some kids and we tortured and pretty much starved them. And oh shit, one of them died from malnutrition. Don't know how that happened because we gave them as much food as
Yeah, they
possible.
wouldn't eat anything except raw beans. Oops.
And like, man, I don't know. It might have been fake, and they just needed to make up a story about how these random green children showed up, and they didn't want to get in trouble that they killed kids or killed a kid, and then integrated another one into their community.
A random girl in their community. You're going to pretend to be a kid that we found. What?
I I just don't see it being anything supernatural or extraterrestrial.
Well, if you or a loved one have encountered green children, please comment down below or send us an email. We would love to hear from you.
That's right. And don't paint your kids green.
But with that being said, do you have anything else you would like to add to today's episode?
Nope. I am all green children out.
That is the end of today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and we love you, and we are proud of you.
That's right. Thank you for your support. Much love.
All right, Dan, would you like to roll us out?
Sure will. It's okay to be out of this world with your thoughts.
Because you are not green, and you are not alone.
Boom. That's the sound. Don't follow it. You might get lost.